I see everyone here this morning. I want to welcome our visitors. We're glad you chose to be with us this morning. I bring greetings to you from the brethren at the Poudre Valley Church of Christ in Fort Collins, Colorado. So I was with them last Sunday, and they may be a small congregation, but as I saw, they are big in heart and full of faith. And they send their greetings along to you. And Richie, who was here in May, he said to make sure to give you a big hello and a greeting from him. I want to say a few things before we get into the lesson. And that is, yesterday marked a year since me and my family have been here. And I want to say how time flies when you're having fun. We have enjoyed being here, and next week will mark another year anniversary. That is when I began working with you. And so I want to tell you again just how blessed you have been to our lives, and we're so grateful to have gotten to know you over this past year and to be working with you. This morning's lesson is entitled, Choose Like Moses. We're going to be taking our text from Hebrews 11, 23 to 27, but I do want to ask a favor. As we go through this, I want you to also, if you're turning to Hebrews 11, turn also to Acts chapter 7, as we're going to do some parallel turning to, or parallel reading. We're going to look in Hebrews 11, but we're also going to be, throughout this morning, also going to Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7. And as you're turning to Hebrews 11, we'll be beginning there very shortly. I want you to remind you of, if you look around right now, if you go into just about any store, you see that back to school season is in full swing. Whether it is the small children going to elementary school, or whether it's the older ones going to high school, or whether it's the young adults going off to college. This is truly the back to school season. And as the back to school season can be both exciting and nerve-wracking for parents as well as for the students, it might even be more so for the parents. As we send our children off to school, as our young adults off to college, whether it's their freshman year or even their senior year, there's an air of excitement and an air of nervousness of what the year might hold. But I want you to think about from the parent standpoint. As we send our children off, they take what they have learned at home into an environment out of the parents' control. They go into the world with all its influences, that many of which will run contrary to what they have learned at home. What they learn is contrary to what they can see in God's Word. And it's good training to see how they're going to handle that, to see if they're going to be an influence for good or if they're going to be susceptible to the influences around them. When children leave their parents' control, whether it's to go to school or whether it's that first job, and you don't know who their co-workers are, who their classmates are, you don't know what their influences that are going to be around them. When they leave our home, they leave an environment that we are in control of. We control what they watch, what they see, what they have as entertainment. But when they leave that home, this is kind of good training for what will happen when they're an adult and they are out of our control. So we need to be watchful. We need to understand who they're hanging out with, who their friends are, what they're seeing, what they're listening to. Children throughout their teen years need strong, godly role models so that when they do go off to school, when they do go off to college, when they take that first job, that we can have that confidence, that we know that they're confident in who they are, that they're confident in who their God is and the God of their parents. Children throughout their teen years need to be able to overcome the strong worldly influences around them. Because we often talk about children when it comes to peer pressure. But that's not the only place we see peer pressure, is it? We see it in the workplace, especially as they get older and they go into a job, maybe they have a career, and those questions come about at the end of the day. Hey, why don't you come with us to the bar? Why don't you come and relax and have a drink with us afterwards? How are they going to handle those kinds of questions? How are they going to handle those influences? What are they going to be able to say? How have you taught them at home? An older Christian woman once told me something that, as my brother and I headed off to college for the very first time, she said something to me that has always stayed with me and something that I try to impart to children now, especially in this back-to-school season. As my brother and I were heading off to college so many years ago, she said, choose like Moses. She didn't give us any scripture reference. She just said, choose like Moses. To quote the Foys, when we got to know them, they always say, make good choices. This is pretty much what this lady was telling us. She said, choose like Moses. Moses is an amazing story of faith and courage, especially for young people who are struggling to overcome our modernistic and our atheistic world. And not just for the young people only, But for any adult of any age, when we go into that workplace, when we go into that college setting, when we go into whatever it is we're going into, there are influences all around us that run contrary to what God has said in His Word. Things that run contrary to our values, our beliefs. And how do we handle those things? Moses' birth occurred during Egypt's oppression and enslavement of the Hebrew people. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, and I invite you to turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11 this is often called the Hall of Faith chapter, the Hebrew writer is reminding his audience of these men and women that overcame great adversity and remained true to God. And he usually starts out by saying, by faith or through their faith. And notice verse 23. It says by faith Moses, but if you keep reading, you'll see this isn't about Moses. This is about his parents. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. If you go back to the beginning part of Exodus chapter 1, you find that there was a king that didn't know Joseph. There was a Pharaoh that arose, he didn't know the Israelites. And he treated them badly. He enslaved them. He decided that at one point that they became too numerous, and he was afraid they could rise up and they could overpower him and his army. And so he ordered the midwives to slay the young males as they're born. And the midwives feared God, and they wouldn't do it. So then he made another edict, and that is that all male children are going to be tossed into the Nile. And we find that that is the edict under which Moses is born. And when he is born, his parents, Hebrews 11 tells us, by their faith, that tells us they were godly parents. By their faith, they would not, dare not, obey the king. So many times in our world today, the parallel is mothers that are able to discard the child growing within them. They give a name, murder, a different name. They call it abortion or a choice or whatever you want to call it. Pharaoh is also having them make a choice too, as they're being born, to toss them into the Nile. And we find that Moses' parents stood up against the king. Hebrews 11:23 says they feared God rather than fear the king. They did not fear his edict. They saw that their son was beautiful, and they hid him for 3 months, as we can read. In Exodus chapter 2, 1-11, this expression of their faith gives us a hint of the kind of instruction that Moses would receive from his mother as she trained him in the first few years of his life. She gave up a lot. Her faith in God required her to give up a lot. She sent him down the Nile River in a basket that had been made waterproof with pitch. But the Pharaoh's daughter picked him out of the water. She named him Moses, meaning plucked from the water. Jochebed, Moses' mother, did not get to name her own son, but another woman got to do that. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses. But as it happened, his sister Miriam was running along the Nile to make sure he was safe. And when she saw that happen, she said, do you need a nurse? And she said, yes. And Moses' mother, Jochebed, was brought in, and she got to nurse him. We know from Hebrew tradition that they would either wean anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And while we have no evidence of how long that might have taken, we can imagine that she would have wanted every last minute she could have had with her son. But we know that their training stuck, because in Exodus chapter 3, when he stood before the burning bush, and that God said to him from the burning bush, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses didn't say, who? Do you mean you're Ra? Or any other God that Egypt had? He took his sandals off because he knew he was on holy ground. He obeyed the voice of God. What Moses learned in his parents' home left a lifelong impression on him and influenced the rest of his life. That tells us that parents, we have an important job to do when our children are at home under our control. Children, you have an important role to fulfill also, to obey your parents, to learn from them, to learn what it means to be godly, so you can handle the influences around you at school or in that first job or at college. Let's take a look at Moses' upbringing. And let's look at how it might parallel the world that we live in today, the kind of world that we send our children into, the kind of world that we ourselves live in and that we go to. The wisdom of the world. Turn with me to Acts chapter 7 and verse 22. Place a marker there in Hebrews 11. We're going to be going back and forth between these two passages. In Acts chapter 7, verse 22, and verse 21, he talks about Pharaoh's daughter plucking Moses out of the Nile River. In verse 22 it says, because he was taken with her into her own home. Verse 21, nurtured as her own son. Verse 22, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. Acts 7:22 tells us Moses was highly educated in the wisdom of his day. The Egyptians were noted for their knowledge and worldly wisdom. In fact, this is made a big deal in 1 Kings 4 and verse 30, when Solomon is made king. And God comes to him and asks him, name it, and I will give it to you. Anything that you want, name it, and it's yours. You know, we often tell those jokes about the genie in the bottle. This was Solomon's chance for that joke to become a reality. God said, name it, I will give it to you. And he said, I want wisdom. I am young, and you have made me king over your people. I want wisdom so that I might know how to conduct myself as ruler of your people. And God said, because you did not ask for riches, I will bless you with riches. Because you did not ask for long life, I will give you longevity as long as you obey me. And I will bless you with wisdom because that is what you asked for. And we're told that he became the wisest man the world has ever seen. And in fact, 1 Kings 4:30 says, Solomon's wisdom even exceeded the wisdom of Egypt. See, even then at Solomon's time, Egypt was still looked at as the height and power of wisdom and education. And that Solomon's wisdom exceeded it all because of the blessing of God. So even in Solomon's time, Egypt was still seen as the education metropolis of the world. And yet Solomon's wisdom exceeded. That was a big deal for it to state. His wisdom even exceeded that of Egypt. Moses was trained in that wisdom. Moses was educated in that time period. He was educated by worldly men who did not know God. They were pantheistic. That means they worshipped many gods. We can go and look in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 to 25, and find that idolaters don't recognize God as creator, but rather they serve the creature rather than the creator. Even though it says creation alone leaves them without excuse. Moses was educated in such a place as that. So Moses' upbringing taught him the wisdom of the world, not of God. Moses' upbringing would have given him false knowledge. In 1 Timothy 6, 20 through 21, it says, O Timothy, guard what's been entrusted to you, avoiding worldly and empty chatter and the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed and thus gone astray from the faith. Grace be with you. This false knowledge, speculations, theories, things that cause shipwreck to faith. They did not shipwreck the faith of Moses later on. 1 Timothy 1:19 tells us there are those that will go about making shipwreck of their faith and shipwrecking the faith of others. Romans 1:25 says of those idolaters that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. It's something false. He was raised with this false knowledge of all the different pantheistic gods of Egypt. They had a god for everything. There was the god of fertility, and oftentimes gods pulled double or triple duty. They were the god of fertility, they were the god of war, they were the god of whatever it is, the god of knowledge, the god of creation. They had multiple different gods who were credited with creation. So as time went on, they said that this god created this, and this god created that, and this god created this over here. There was the god of the Nile, there was the god of harvest, there was the god of all the different seasons. False knowledge. This is what Moses would have been trained into. And yet we can read in 2 Corinthians 10, 4 through 5, that by our faith, we can overcome these lofty speculations. We can take captive the thoughts and hearts of people to be obedient to Christ. We read of Moses, that this was his attitude, this was his heart, this was his character. His faith overthrew their speculation. He saw through it because he knew who his people were. And he knew who their God was. Therefore, he knew who his God was. Moses was not only brought up in worldly wisdom and the false knowledge of the day, but he was brought up in moral corruption. Not only did his training place no emphasis on God, he would have constantly faced great pressure to compromise his morality. The pharaohs, like the Caesars of Rome, the pharaohs of Egypt, were not known for their morality. They were not known for being moral people. And Romans 1:18-25 describes what an idolatrous world does on society. An idolatrous world will decay a society. It will destroy it. He lived in an idolatrous world, which leads to a wicked and sinful society. If you read Romans 1:26-32, as it describes an idolatrous society, it describes one that leads to gross immorality. Because you can find a God that will fit any one of the things that you would like to do. And say, well, I'm only following this God. And you could choose what God you want to serve. Any sin, any desire that you have, there's a God that fits it. Just as there was in Egypt, and then Babylon, and then Greece, and then Rome. And so it is today. People find reasons and justifications to do the things that they want to do, regardless of the consequences, and regardless of what God has to say about it. Idolatry is alive and well today. Look in Colossians 3:5. It says, therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. Anything that takes place of God in our lives becomes our idol. Whether it is we give our bodies over to immorality, whether it is we give ourselves to impurity and passions and evil desires and greed, that is that covetousness, where we're coveting something that does not belong to us, that is forbidden to us. These things amount to idolatry. Christians are warned not to practice such things. You know, as we look at Moses' upbringing, we can see a lot of similarities, can't we? Being raised in the wisdom of the world, being given false knowledge, being trained in moral corruption. It's very similar to some educational institutions today. It doesn't take long to turn on the news or even look online and see what's happening at college campuses all over the world, especially in our country. The things that they are being taught, the things that are being tolerated. And some new schools, even elementary schools, as they're being built, what they're pushing it for kindergartners, as they want to raise them to not see gender. There's a school that was being built just recently here in Virginia. And they built it where no bathrooms have any labels. That boys and girls are taught they can go wherever they want to go and with who they ever want to go to. In 20 years, they're going to be very confused children. And those children are going to grow up to be very confused adults. What do we do about it? What kind of information are we arming our children with that go into such institutions? What are we arming them with that they might be able to combat that and to see through the false knowledge and the moral corruption of our day? And when we think we have it bad, remember what Moses was brought up with. He could make up any god that he wanted to and serve that god in whatever its immorality was. Although educated in a system of science and religion, neither of which acknowledged God or revered God, he remained true to God. You might remember when he goes to Pharaoh and he says, I am has sent me. He says, Jehovah, Yahweh has sent me. Remember what Pharaoh says very early on when Moses first comes? I don't know your God. I don't know that God. So no, you can't go. No, your people can't go. And God told Moses, I'm going to show him who I am. I'm going to display myself even to my people in a way that not even their forefathers knew me. And by a mighty hand, by the end of it, Pharaoh knew who God was. As did the Israelites. There was no question and no doubt. But we can see Moses stayed true to God despite that upbringing. So we can find this possible today. Moses' world compared with ours. In many ways, our world is not that much different from his. These same three things, worldly wisdom, false knowledge, and moral corruption, are prevalent in our society. They're prevalent in our educational system. Humanism. I'm going to let a humanist explain or define the word humanism. This is from Julian Huxley. He's the signer of the Humanist Manifesto that took place in 1973. These are quoting directly from him. He says, and I quote, I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that humans are just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant. That our bodies, our minds, and souls were not supernaturally created, but are the products of evolution. And that we are not under control or guidance of any supernatural beings, but have to rely on ourselves and our own powers. The fallacy of that argument that many people find as they grow older and they buy into this is that means that their strength is within themselves That means that they can do whatever they want to do and they become a god unto themselves. And that's exactly what humanism teaches. That we don't need God. That we are all the force, we are all the strength that we need. And atheism, this is the existence of God, is denied. Psalm 14:1, Psalm 36:1-4. It is the fool who says in his heart, there is no God. It's the denial of God. No atheistic society has ever been a righteous society. Remember even God's own people in Judges 21, verse 25. When an entire generation grew up that did not know God, what did God's own people who had brought out of Egypt to form the nation Israel, what did they do with that worldly wisdom, that false knowledge, and that moral corruption? What did they do with that all around them? And a generation grew up that didn't know God. Remember what it said in Judges 21:25? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And what was their society like? It was so corrupt, God judged them because they should have known better. But everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Atheism causes that. Even when God's own people rejected him. Look in 1 Kings chapter 17. We're not going to read that this morning. I encourage you to read that on your own. That is God's litmus test against the northern 10 tribes of Israel for all the things that they had done against him. They rejected him. They rejected his word. They rejected his prophets. They put to death his prophets. They rejected the message. They served the gods of the nations around them. And then over in Judah, 2 Chronicles 36:16. In 2 Chronicles 36:16, it says three things about the way Judah, the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, who outlasted the northern 10 tribes of Israel. But it says three things against them that they did. It says they mocked, they despised, and they scoffed the prophets, the word of God, and God himself. It says in 2 Chronicles 36:16, they mocked, they despised, they scoffed, until there was no remedy. There was no hope. There was no second chance. And they were carried away to Babylon for 70 years. Even God's own people, when they denied God, it brought calamity upon them. No atheistic society has ever been a righteous society. And evolution. Once God is taken out of the picture, man attempts to explain the existence of life with things which require more faith than creation. That is, that matter is eternal. That goes against the second law of thermodynamics that says matter is not eternal, and yet it takes great faith to believe in evolution. That matter is eternal, that life spontaneously arose out of non-living matter, and one kind evolved into a completely different kind of life. It's not observable. It's bad science. It's a theory, and yet it's taught as fact in many educational institutions. I was fortunate as I grew up, as I went into college, and I had an astronomy professor. He would not teach us those things. The way he taught us, he said the college demanded that he taught us about the Big Bang, and they demanded that he taught about evolution, but he himself would not do it. So he had us watch a video by Carl Sagan, and he said, let Carl Sagan do it, but it won't be on a test. So if you want to take Carl Sagan's video this hour to take a break, go eat lunch, whatever you want to do, come back, and it's fine with me. I was very fortunate, because I knew other students who had other science professors that didn't teach that way. But they taught it as fact, even though it's called the theory of evolution. They teach it as fact. And that one kind evolved into a completely different kind of life. And even when you talk to people who believe in evolution, even when they want to tell you about the Big Bang, where they are stymied is when you ask, all right, even if all that is true, where did the two asteroids come from? What created them? There's no answer. They want to tell you life all came from one Big Bang of two asteroids colliding together. But they cannot tell you where those two asteroids came from. Relative truth. This is that truth is relative. There's no absolutes. People are being taught in school and on television and the lives of everyone they know that there's no absolute standard of right and wrong, but that they will have to decide what's right and wrong for them. They have to decide what their truth is, that no one can decide for them. It's in a vicious cycle. Humanism and society teaches mankind to do what's right for them. There's no right or wrong, but then also wants society to abide by laws. And so then you have a whole generation rising up saying, why do we have these laws? And these laws get overturned and new laws take their place because society will only function with laws. But see, humanism tells us that no one can tell us what to do. It's a vicious cycle. Truth is relative. Again, Judges 21, verse 25. Even God's own people fell to relative truth. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it was a godless society, and one that was punished. So as we talk about Moses' world, and we talk about the world that we live in today and how comparable it is to Moses' upbringing, saints and young people today must still choose like Moses to overcome the world. What was Moses' decision? His decision was slavery or royalty. It's really the same choice we have today. In Romans 6, 16, 18, we're told that we're going to be slaves to whatever it is we obey. We're either going to obey sin, resulting in death, or we're going to obey righteousness, resulting in our sanctification and eternal life, as you get down to verse 23. So we can choose slavery. We can be a slave to sin. Or Romans 8, 14 to 17 tells us we're children of the King. We're children of God by adoption. That the Holy Spirit Himself testifies that we are His children. So we choose to either be a slave to sin or to be a child of God. This was the choice before Moses. Slavery or royalty. He was a prince of Egypt. He grew up the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He would grow up in the palace, the lap of luxury, whatever he wanted at his fingertips. You see, there's a price to be paid for commitment and doing the right thing. Even Jesus paid that price. Hebrews 5, 8 to 9. Jesus paid the price of obedience, and it was His death. In Hebrews 11, 24 through 26, I invite you to turn over there with me. In Hebrews chapter 11, 24. It says, by faith Moses. We talked in verse 23 about his parents. Now we get to him. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses had a choice when he grew up, to throw in his lot with the slavery of his people, or to stay in the lap of luxury as Pharaoh's son, Pharaoh's daughter's son, Pharaoh's grandson. But he refused to be called Pharaoh's daughter's son. Instead, it said, he chose to endure ill treatment with the people of God. Why? Because he saw something else. He saw an eternal reward. He had another choice to make, pain or pleasure. Slavery, the ill treatment of God's people, or to stay in the passing pleasures of sin. It's the same choices people make today. We're going to read 2 Corinthians 4, 16, 18 a little later on, so we're not turning there now. But 2 Corinthians 4, 16, 18 tells us that affliction of the world is light in comparison to the glory that's going to come. It's light in comparison to what will be revealed later. It also has a comparable passage in Romans 8, 18 that says nothing that we suffer in this world can even compare to the glory to be revealed. You know, he could have continued enjoying the luxuries that only the king's court could provide for him. Any sin that he wanted to engage in without reprisal, Pharaoh wasn't going to chastise him. Pharaoh's daughter wasn't going to chastise him. Any sin that he wanted was at his fingertips. He could have had pain or pleasure, but he saw it as that passing pleasures of sin. He saw it for what it was. He saw through Satan's deceit that it's only passing. In Acts chapter 7, 35 to 36. Acts chapter 7, 35 to 36. After telling us that Moses' own people turned against him, they said, who are you? Who made you our ruler and judge? It says in verse 35, this Moses whom they disowned, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one whom God sent to be both a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the thorn bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. And he goes on to say, this is the Moses that said God would raise up a prophet like him. Moses made the decision to do what was right. Because it was right, whatever the consequences were that followed, they were immaterial. When he made that choice, when he went out, when he was 40 years old and saw that Egyptian mistreating a slave, and it became a life or death situation, Moses struck the Egyptian and killed him. He made a choice right then and there. He threw in his lot with God's people. Now he thought he covered it up, but the next day, as Acts chapter 7 reveals, as Stephen is recounting this, he sees two of his own brethren fighting. And he stops them and says, "Why are you injuring each other? Your brethren." And they said, "Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? Who made you ruler and judge over us?" And then he knew what that decision cost him. He had to flee. And it cost him his home. It cost him everything. He had to flee into the wilderness. And there he dwelt, made a family for himself for another 40 years. Sin is an enjoyable thing. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be tempted. Right? We're tempted to do the things we want to do because it's enjoyable. We want to do them. Moses saw it for what it is. Passing pleasures of sin. And he had to weigh what he saw against either eternal or earthly. Eternal or temporary. The same choices people must make today. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 9, 24-27, that the athlete will run according to the rules. He competes for a perishable crown. A reward that is perishable. It's going to fade away. It's going to be destroyed. He says, but we run the race for an imperishable reward. So we have to choose between earthly rewards and eternal rewards. Why did Moses make this difficult decision? What on earth swayed him to give up everything that he had? According to the world's standards, he gave up very much earthly success. He gave up riches. He gave up royalty. He gave up perhaps even being in line to be king one day. He was already a rich man. What swayed him to do it? From his childhood, he had everything he could want or dream of having. You know, there's a saying that says, no home is more corrupt than a reigning king. Moses had anything that he wanted. Acts 7, 21-22 says he was taken in as Pharaoh's daughter's son, and he was powerful in words and deeds. From his childhood, he had everything he could want. But Hebrews 11, 26-27, Moses saw beyond the temporary and the material. In Hebrews 11, verse 26 says, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Telling us his faith was in God. He saw God who could offer him more than Egypt ever could. Look in the Acts chapter 7 passage, in verses 37 and 38. This is the Moses who said to the sons of Israel, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness together with the angel who was speaking to him on Mount Sinai, who was with our fathers, and he received living oracles to pass on to you. He not only chose throwing his lot with them, but he obeyed the voice of God. He led the people, and he's the one that delivered to them the oracles of God. That is the 10 Commandments and the law that followed. He delivered those things. He became a law deliverer. But he saw beyond the temporary. He saw beyond the material. He saw it as what it was, passing pleasures of sin. Now, these are the same choices we must make today. Slavery or royalty? Are we going to be a slave of sin, or are we going to be a child of the King? Are we going to endure the pain of this life or the pleasure of it by giving ourselves over to the world? Jesus in Matthew 10 told his disciples the world hates him, it hated him first, therefore it's going to hate his followers. But it says it loves its kind. It loves those who are of the world. He says you're not of the world, so they're going to hate you. We choose either pain or pleasure. Do we belong to God, or do we belong to the world? Do we see it for what it is, an eternal reward versus an earthly reward? These are the same choices we make. These are the choices that we are sending our children to make when they're out of our control. How have you taught them? What have you armed them with? To face the moral corruption in our society. They're going to see it. What have you trained them with to combat the false information? To combat worldly wisdom that tells them they're their own truth. They can do whatever they want. No one can stand in their way. You know, when we were in Colorado, we were homeschooled. And my brother and I were in college, but we attended a school expo where you could buy books. I think it was a book fair. And my sister was taken aside by someone, a teacher there, and told her, you know, if your parents try to spank you, you can call 911, and in fact, call this number to CPS. They'll come and rescue you. And she got spanked. She did something that very night. And she called 911 and said, I was given a number by a lady, said they'll come and rescue me. You know, that's the worldly wisdom that's out there. You don't have to listen to your parents. You don't have to be disciplined by them. You're your own person. You can do what you want to do. Parents, we have to combat that. Children, you have to combat that. You have to know better. Sometimes you have to know better than the people around you. They're telling you those things. And where are you going to get it from? You need to get it, one, from your parents. Two, you need to get it from God's Word. That's the source of truth. They're the same choices we must make today as the very same choices that we see Moses had to make from his upbringing. Moses was in a very hostile environment. No home is more corrupt than a reigning king. And yet he retained his spiritual priorities. And yet when God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he knew who he was speaking to. Philippians 2:15 tells us saints are to be children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And then he tells the Philippians they're doing it. He says, among whom you appear as lights in the world. Now, how do we do that? How do we teach our children to do that? What are we equipping them with? And I know we have many educators here in the audience. And I'm thankful we have Christian teachers. Because you are a force for good. You too go into a corrupt society. You too go into a place of work that is trying to teach worldly wisdom, that is trying to teach moral corruption. And you get to be that beacon of light. And you get to say, no, I will not teach that to my children. No, I will not teach that to these children, these precious, innocent souls. I'm thankful for the teachers we have. Because you get to be that influence. You get to be that light. You get to be with children who may not get that at home. You get to be that voice of sanity, that voice of truth and reason. Moses chose the spiritual path with eternal rewards that far outweighed the physical. Romans chapter 8:18, Paul says, whatever we suffer on earth can't even compare to the eternal reward that is to come. But as we close this morning, I want to turn our attention to 2 Corinthians 4:16-18. Therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary, light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Moses chose that spiritual path with eternal rewards that far outweighed the passing pleasures of sin. Parents, remember Moses' upbringing began in the home with his parents. Be active and vigilant about what your children are learning in school, what influence are around them, what friends they have, what they're listening to, what they're watching. Be vigilant, be alert, and know what they're taking into their ears, because what they take into their ears goes into their heart and their mind. Children, young people, as you head back to school, or to college, or to that job, you need to be wise decision makers. Make good choices. Choose like Moses. Choose to be a child of God. Choose royalty over slavery. Or choose to be that royalty is to be that child of God. Make the right decisions. Choose God's people over the people of the world. Those are the choices before you. And you too can be an influence for good. You too can be that godly influence no matter what your age. My encouragement for us, no matter what age you find yourself, no matter where you find yourself at, choose like Moses. If you're subject to an invitation in any way this morning, we encourage you to either repent of your sins, be baptized for the forgiveness of those sins, or to ask for the prayers of the congregation on your behalf, repenting of those sins, knowing that we stand ready to assist you in whatever it is. Come forward now while together we stand and sing.